And we're live. Hey everyone, I know that it's been a while, but we have some really good information to share with you on tonight's community hall. Today we're going to be discussing MIRA and how it's being upgraded to an anti-terrorism bill as a result of the events that happened at the Capitol on January 6th. So today we're going to be having this conversation with the volunteers from the movement. Ooh, I'm echoing. So what we're doing today is we're going to be having conversations with everyone to talk about what this means for what we're going to be doing for lobbying, what our next steps are, and how this benefits our community and also benefits service members and veterans. So what I want to do before I go really in depth with everything, I'm going to give you a really quick summary on what we're doing. We have been in conversations with Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, and many of you know that she has been spearheading MJIA. We are looking to consolidate MJIA with MIRA and having that bill upgraded, and it's been sent to the National Security Committee for review as an anti-terrorism bill. So we're currently awaiting the review for that, and once that comes back, we're looking to have that authored in its entirety into MJIA. So I want to start with Carrie. Carrie, you were in on that meeting with us. So I really want to hear from you about what your thoughts are and your experience are, especially as somebody who's worked in intelligence.
So I was really encouraged by the conversation that we had. Am I echoing on your end too?
No, I don't hear you echoing.
Okay, I'm echoing really bad on myself. But I was really encouraged by the conversation that we had with the staff from Senator Gillibrand's office. They seemed really receptive to the ideas that were presented from MIRA, and especially looking at everything that's happened in the last few weeks. It was. I hadn't quite expected the conversation to go the way it did, but it was really encouraging. And from the perspective of statistically how much how sexual assault cases are reported and how they're handled and or not handled most of the time, and how that impacts the service as a whole. I know that Senator Gillibrand's office has been pretty active in the past and still are in trying to get MJIA passed, and incorporating the aspects from MIRA would definitely be beneficial. So
Okay, I just want to ask you real quick before I move on to Albie, Carrie.
Sorry.
What are some ways that you think women and minorities in particular will benefit from MIRA becoming an anti-terrorism legislation?
I think that looking at sexual assault as an act of terrorism is, that's what it is to those of us who've been through it, right? But making it that on a larger scale and looking at it from that perspective when investigating and prosecuting, I think that's going to be, I think that'll be really eye-opening. I truly hope it'll be eye-opening to people, because, I mean, that's what it is an act of terror.
And I completely agree with that. I think a lot of people don't, we've been discussing this over the last couple of months about the relationship between white nationalism and military sexual trauma, but I don't think that unless you've gone through it yourself, I don't think a lot of people really understand the gravity of how these systemic issues really impact survivors, and particularly women and minorities. I want to turn to Albie and ask their opinion on how this legislation will protect transgender service members throughout their time enlisted, and as well for those who are going to be coming into the military?
Thanks so much. So in advance, I have an autoimmune disease and I have been flaring, so I apologize in advance. I have not been feeling well today. But when it comes to MIRA and it becoming anti-terrorism legislation, what this means for the LGBTQ community, first off, we all know the statistics. We know that a person of color who is transgender is more likely to be sexually assaulted than a cisgender white male. And that's just what the reality is. We can look at statistics outside of the military to confirm that. So what this means for our community, we have more protections now. It will be easier to take the having it being taken out of the hands of the command is so important. It will definitely help curb command abuse, which is a very real thing for MST survivors. Sometimes in my work, I have heard over the years that the command abuse was worse than the event itself. And that is something very real. It is a form of terrorism. And I think it's very important to protect the community and having that inclusion for LGBTQ and trans service members.
So thank you for sharing that with us, because, you know, something that we've advocated for, that we've always advocated for and will always continue to advocate for, is the LGBTQIA community. And, you know, I think a lot of times when people think about addressing problems, they tend to think about just what they've gone through versus what other minority groups are dealing with and what those struggles look like. Especially, I want to piggyback. And I'm
going back to the systemic, like it's in the system, like that. Our military has a history of, you know, treating those in the LGBTQ community horribly. I mean, we had Don't Ask, Don't Tell. There was a time period that you would be kicked out of the military for just who you love. And let's be honest, those laws have just very recently changed. We're talking the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell was in 2011. So barely 10 years ago. And that was a great first step for members of the LGBT community. But that did not address the issues with our trans community. And that is something that we still have to fight for, you know, making sure that we have inclusive healthcare and mental health care as well. These are things that, you know, especially in this administration, you know, it shouldn't matter who you love or how you identify. If you are an able-bodied American, if you want to serve your country, you should be able to. And we finally have an administration that agrees with this and is willing to work with us on that. And that's a great start, but there's still a lot of work to be done. And that's why having MIRA being an anti-terrorism legislation is a good thing. Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And, you know, thank you for being an advocate, because that's one of the main focus points that we did have in our conversation with Gillibrand's staffers, is that we want this legislation to be completely inclusive. And, you know, members of the military who are serving our country, people who are putting their lives on the line, irregardless of who you love, irregardless of your ethnic background, your culture, your identity, no matter what it is, you deserve to be protected. And it's unfortunate that the level of extremism that is in the military is preventing people from having meaningful careers, particularly minorities, and the amount of systemic and institutionalized discrimination has adversely impacted members of the LGBTQIA community, particularly transgender service members at this point, right? So one of the other major minority groups that has been severely adversely impacted that we generally don't talk about as much as we should is the Latinx community. And, you know, a lot of people fail to realize that if somebody is from the Latinx community, they are at most risk to go through MST based on their nationality. So I want to talk a little bit to Millie and ask her opinion as a Latinx woman, what this anti-terrorism legislation will do, and why it's a really good initiative to the fact that MIRA is getting upgraded to anti-terrorism legislation. So I'm going to turn it over to her. Hi, Millie.
Hi. So I'm going to kind of piggyback off of what Carrie and Albie said, because they both brought up really, really good points, especially talking about how, you know, being sexually assaulted in the military is very traumatic, and it is an act of terrorism when you think about it, because we're service members. We are there doing our job, protecting this country, and the very people that we are literally depending on deployments to get us home alive are the very ones that are terrorizing us. And it's not just from the perpetrator, but the chain of command. And like Albie said, you know, a lot of times that could be worse. The repercussions and the retaliation and the fact that they allow it is horrendous. And I can speak from that firsthand. But bringing MIRA up to an anti-terrorism legislation, I'm hoping that taking it out of the hands of the chain of command, like they've been, like they've had, giving that power to people, or taking the power away from those who can best protect the perpetrators, and bring more victimization to the people that were assaulted is huge, because it needs to be done. I mean, if you think about, look at a regular police force. When there's something done within the police force, their own police force can't, you know, investigate it. So why is it okay for that to happen in the military?
Thank you for sharing your perspective, because I think a lot of times we do neglect that other systems do have higher levels of checks and balances than what we have in the military. So, you know, I can definitely appreciate the fact that you're talking about the need to have this system of checks and balances to prevent terrorism against service members. And I think January 6th was a rude awakening when, you know, 20% of the people who participated and organized at the U.S. Capitol are veterans and service members. I think that was a rude awakening for people in power to be like, hey, we have an issue, because it's like, we've all known this, because we've all lived it, we've all said something about it, we've all come forward and, you know, talked about how we were feeling, and we've come forward. But at the same time, it's like a lot of our voices were kind of being shunned out, because it's like, at first, it's like, well, you went through that and you went through that. And then it's like, oh, now there's statistics saying all of you went through this. All of us went through this. We're all from minority communities. We're women and minorities, you know, which some of us are double minorities. And now it's like we see the systemic issues that are happening. And it's like, oh, wait, nationalism and violence are tied to MST, right? And I think now is the time that people are starting to wake up to really understand how the dots connect, and are really able to understand the problem at hand, where before people weren't really connecting the dots. So, you know, I just want to say before I turn this over to Ellie, is that for me in particular, this is really a groundbreaking and astounding move that I really think it's going to make a difference, a very strong difference, because you're not looking at the effect of the problem, you're looking at the cause of the problem. And when you address the cause of the problem and the root of the problem, you're able to address the problems that it creates. And having MIRA being upgraded to anti-terrorism legislation is really a win for us, because now this is going to be something that's, you know, really part of changing the entire culture within the military. I do know that this is a new direction that we're moving in, but it is much more in line with what our goals are. And also after everything spilled over publicly, right? Like, we go through this while we're enlisted. All of these acts of violence that happen against us now happen to our Congress people and senators. So this is an opportunity for us to really apply the pressure and generate meaningful results that have lasting impacts for future generations of young people. I want to turn to Ellie. Ellie was on the call with us, and I want to hear your perspective on how you feel about MIRA being upgraded to anti-terrorism legislation, and how you think that this is going to better impact our community.
Yeah, I mean, there is part of me that, you know, still doesn't quite believe that, you know, it hasn't been already recognized as such. A lot of people in the community know, you know, I'm a civilian. I'm not a survivor of MST. I'm just an ally here, trying to help disabled members of the community, you know, get engaged in politics. And you know, my experience of sexual violence that I have experienced, as has been touched on previously, the reporting of my experience and the fact that because of my disability as a blind woman, I couldn't access the justice system to get the justice that I deserved, caused me far more pain than the actual attack itself. And when I learned about MST around this time last year, really, is when I joined the movement. I was horrified that this was happening to people serving the country. It was a real kind of slap in the face, really, to me, of unfortunately, you know, all of these, the way that veterans are often used as like almost political pawns in politics, right? Of we support our veterans and thank you for your service and all of this kind of attitude. I couldn't believe that there was this kind of massive problem that seemed to have been neglected. And it should not be the case that I, a civilian from Britain, should be able to relate to the stories of American veterans. Like, you put that into perspective, that is ridiculous. We are not protecting service members properly from terrorism. And so for me, this is absolutely a step in the right direction, but one that I almost can't believe didn't happen sooner. And yeah, that's my opinion.
Definitely appreciate you sharing your opinion. You know, I think it's great that you're such a strong ally for us, and that you also really understand what it is that we go through. You know, and also too, like, as someone who has a disability, you know, it may be a different type of disability, but obviously we can all relate to your struggles as well. And I think that's why we've done so well together as a group and an organization of really, you know, having these conversations. And also the fact that we're able to, you know, see all of these different lines and storylines and everyone's background, but be able to come together.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I've spoken a bit publicly about this before anyway, but you know, I was homeless before I came to America, and I remember, you know, I've been in the movement for a few months, and you know, learning about the homelessness rates, you know, of veterans who have survived MST, and I was like, this is absolutely ridiculous that, you know, I keep finding these, you know, ways to relate my story to the story of survivors of MST. Like, this just shouldn't be happening. And the fact that civilians still don't know about it. Like, people still don't know that this is going on, and I think it's, yeah, I'm just really happy that I can be here and help in some way.
Well, we are all happy that you're here and that you're helping. I also think that, I think it's hard for everybody who's ever gone through sexual violence to be able to fight back and really work to make a difference. It's just, it's hard in general to go through trauma and then try to function and then try to fight the system. Like it's overwhelming dealing with your trauma and then saying, hey, we have a problem that's happening to all of us. We're all women and minorities and we all have the same problem and no one's listening to us. So, I think the general consensus that we're having is that we're very happy with the direction that this is going in, and we're very happy to work with Senator Gillibrand and her staffers to be able to work on merging MIRA with MJIA as anti-terrorism legislation, and really put strong reinforcements in place to prevent sexual violence from happening, to have education, to have systems of accountability, and be able to have avenues of justice. Like, this legislation is so much broader than just MST. It's really preventing extremism and creating an environment where women and minorities can thrive and have meaningful careers versus leaving the military within 12 months after they go through sexual violence, right? Because that's what we're seeing as the trend now. And to piggyback off of what Ellie said, that when we look at the rates of homelessness, we're looking at these, really horrible and horrific rates of homelessness amongst veterans who have reported MST. So there is a lot of systemic injustices and systemic failures that are occurring.
Yeah, I just, it's something you said that just like really resonated with me for a minute, just like as a civilian, of, you were saying how, one of the great reasons for us to support this becoming an anti-terrorist bill, is because it's far more broader than just the MST itself. And, that, just really made me think of how I think a lot of the reason that a lot of civilians either don't know about MST or don't know how to engage with it as an issue or kind of clam up, like, oh, I don't know what to say regarding it, is I think it's understandable, but the effects of MST are more than just the survivor itself, because it could be, your employee who has gone through it. It could be your neighbor or your sister or your daughter. And I think that broadness of how far the effects of MST goes, I like how that reflects the broadness of it becoming an anti-terrorist bill. Just wanted to throw that out there.
I think that that's probably one of the most important things to all of us is that, we all come from different backgrounds, different walks of life, different cultures, different ideologies and principles. And I think ultimately what every single one of us wants out of this, right? Like as the bottom line is we want the next generation of service members to go in and be able to manifest their dreams while in service to our nation, provide equal treatment, access to justice, and be protected, right? Like
that's 100% it. Yeah. No, I think about my nieces and my nephews, right?
Right.
So my oldest nephew is he's gonna go to boot camp. It got pushed back because of COVID, but I'm thankful that he's continuing this line of service in our family. But then I think about like my nieces. Like my oldest niece is 14 years old, and I want my niece to be able to join the military and not have to fear going through what I did. So, because I don't see a problem with service. I think if for the right reasons, it's a great thing. Disregarding, an economic draft or any of those issues. But, just the idea that I want the next generation of service members to really hold true to those values.
Yeah.
I want them to do that, and I think we are really held back with old school leadership who it's a different generation.
And I agree with that. I think a lot of times what happens is, how do we raise a standard when we have the people before us failing to meet a standard that us, because think about it, all of us are millennials, right? Like, we're all millennials and we're sitting here like, this isn't okay. We're going to say something. We're not going to allow this to keep going. And we're looking at the people who are in the positions of power to make change. And when we're looking at those people, like, these people are like 70 and 80 years old, like they're up there in age. So, for them, this isn't a priority, where for us, we're like, no, like the next generation, we want equality in the military, right? Like, that we want equality, we want justice, like the same things that we're fighting for in the Constitution, the same things that we're swearing in for are the same things we want for ourselves that we don't have protection for. And, I think a lot of times it's like even with what happened at the Capitol, it took violence on Congress for Congress to wake up and be like, oh, I think something in the military culture is a little fucked up. And it's like, all of us were like, well, we were in there and we went through these experiences, and we've been telling you that we've been going through this, and like, you've been ignoring us. And now the violence that was all on us is getting turned on you guys. And now you guys are like, so what do we do? And that's the thing that I think we've been trying to prevent all along, is we don't want this to happen to anyone else. We want a military that, when violence is necessary, it's because we're fighting for our Bill of Rights. If a violence is necessary, it's because we're fighting for freedom. But what we don't want is violence against us within our own organization, within our own country, on the basis of white nationalism, on the basis because we're women and minorities. Like, we want to be able to be within the military and exert and demonstrate what American values are, which is justice, freedom, and, diversity and inclusion. Like, that's what America is. That is why we're called the melting pot. So, we should all be able to serve together. And while we're serving together, that we are able to, no matter what background we come from, when that uniform comes on, that we're a team with a mission in mind, and that we all deserve to be protected. And, I really feel that all of us have that mindset in our minds. And I want to turn it back to Carrie, and I wanted to have her talk about, how she feels about not only this legislation, but what would your advice be to the next generation of service members? And why do you feel that this legislation particularly would protect them?
So actually, this past week, in one of my classes, we've been studying microaggressions, and the question was raised, what population would you work with more, the older population or the younger population, when trying to, retrain the way we interact with other people? And the general consensus was the younger population, because you can train them where the older ones you can't. And I think, that kind of got touched on a little bit when we were, you all were discussing it being a previous generation of leadership that seems to be kind of one of the major hangups here. And this process has taken a long time to get us where we are, but there's still a long way to go. And my hope is that, in the future, with this legislation, that the future generations of service members won't have to live in fear of this, of sexual assault being something that they have to, possibly face.
No.
something that, stood out to me during the conversation with Senator Gillibrand, and a note I had, jotted down for myself, was that the Declaration of Independence states that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men, women, all humans, right, are created equal, and that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. And among them are the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And for me personally, I believe that preventing MST and protecting all of those who have experience is part of this, right? We shouldn't have to be fighting for the right not to be raped. Rape shouldn't have to be a political issue. And unfortunately, that's kind of what it seems like it is. That's what it feels like as somebody, that's fighting this. It shouldn't be a political issue. It should be a basic human right for us to be able to serve and not be raped. But, here we are.
I mean, I think all of us agree to that, otherwise we wouldn't be here. So it is very true. I think all of us have thought about that in some time, because when you think about, PTSD due to MST or any other mental health issue as it relates to MST, it impacts your well-being and prevents you from attaining happiness. Like to find happiness, you have to then deal with the trauma that you endured. And then, also learn about what's happening to your body physiologically, perhaps go on medication, on top of the therapeutic avenues that you have to take. And it really does become a burden. So it's like, we do have the Declaration of Independence that says that we have the right to pursue happiness. All of us are thinking we're going to the military to pursue happiness and pursue careers. Then we go to the military and we don't get any of that. We become endangered and our lives are put on the line. And then military leadership is like, oh, well, that's a part of your job function. It's in, the Fairness Doctrine does says that you could get raped. Doesn't matter whether it's overseas or not, but you have to deal with it because that's what you signed up for. And you're like, I didn't know this was going to happen. And now you're telling me that, like, I'm going to have a mental illness for the rest of my life, struggle for the rest of my life, and I have no avenues or recourses to even make myself happier. So I think that's a really valid point. I want to turn the conversation to Albie. As someone who served in the military and being transgender, what advice would you give to the next generation of service members who are transgender, who are considering entering the military? What advice would you give them? And what is the best thing you've learned in your course of advocacy that you think every transgender young person should have in their pocket when they join the military?
Okay, so first, I don't identify as transgender. I identify as non-binary. So, little microaggression there, understandable. But, oh gosh.
Sorry, I was apologizing.
I was like, what? Okay, so like, and here's the thing. I don't even think it would matter like what someone's gender identity was. Funny story. Last week I went to my favorite burger place that support local. And I went to pay and I had my USAA card and they looked at me and they're like, "Oh, what branch?" And I'm like, "Oh, Navy." And the guy looked at me and he got super excited and he was like, "Oh, I'm leaving for boot camp in a few months." And I know it sounds weird, but I looked at him and I just wanted to be like, "I'm sorry." Like, bad idea. And that's my personal feelings for so many reasons. But specifically for, trans members, gosh, I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know what to say except don't do it. And I think that's just because my experience was so horrible. And yes, I served during Don't Ask, Don't Tell. It was very different. I think maybe if I had served once Don't Ask, Don't Tell had been repealed, it might have felt different. I will say they're definitely going to be breaking glass ceilings, you know, and even if you're not doing it on purpose, you know, the community has so many influential members of the community who are in our history books. And honestly, you know, both the LGBTQ, the LGBTQ flag and the trans flag were both created by veterans. That is part of our history. If you are trans and going in, no, you're gonna be breaking glass ceilings, even if you're not trying to do it. And to be fully aware of that, you know, when I think back when I ran for office, you know, I was running for like 6 months before someone was like, "Oh, you're the first non-binary candidate on the federal as a federal candidate." And you know, I think it's so important that representation matters, and I think they're our leaders of the future. And I try to be pragmatic, but who knows, you know? But MIRA as an anti-terrorism piece of legislation, it's a great start. It's a great start.
Well, thank you. And also, again, I want to apologize for misgendering you and misgendering your identity. I'm still learning, so I just wanted to put that out there because that was not intentional.
Nope, and I totally get it. And you know what was funny is I have gone by they, them for quite a while now. And I was talking to another member person in the community, and we were talking about transitioning and all of that, and they assumed I was trans as well, and I was just like, oh no, like that's definitely not what I would consider, and that is why it's always important, you know, if you're meeting people for the first time, you know, throw your pronouns out there because it makes life so much easier. So I am LB, which is short for Amanda Leanne Brunzel, and my pronouns are they, them.
Well, I definitely appreciate that you're spending time educating us because it's something that we all need to learn. Like, that's the future, whether or not people like it, right? It's like we're looking for a more inclusive culture, so we have to behave in a more inclusive way. Like, that's just the way that it is. So, you know, I do appreciate the fact that you are bearing with us while we're learning because there's a lot. The more that I have learned about the LGBTQIA community has been directly from the movement. And I learned something every single day, like every single day. I've met everyone. Like we have somebody on the classification spectrum everywhere, and everyone is different. So it's, you know, you're like you said, it really takes, you know, you gotta be willing to have a conversation up front when you're first meeting people to really learn who they are and their stories. And I do think that that's an important conversation, is to talk about pronouns and, you know, what you identify as, because it creates an open and healthy culture that, like, hey, you're different from me, you're accepted, we're fighting the same fight, and we're in this together. It doesn't matter what your background is.
And that is something incredibly important, especially, and, you know, there is the very rightly so wrong assumption that, you know, MST is a mixed gender, you know, male on male and female on female. sexual assault happens. It is a very real thing. And we have to remember that, we shouldn't assume anything. And no one should be ashamed of, being a military sexual trauma survivor. And, I love the work that we do with the MST movement, because it is so important. I want my nieces to be able to serve in the military and not be afraid of getting sexually assaulted.
We have a question here that I want to turn to really quick before we move on. Thank you for sharing your story and your perspective. Again, I think it's very helpful in creating a more open communication. So I definitely think that hearing what different communities are going through is very important for us to be able to move forward. Let me read this real quick. Hello, veterans. It just popped in. I haven't read MIRA anti-terrorism legislation, but I'm very interested in combating sexism in the military. Enough sexism. It's all about the ego. Yeah, I mean, if you've seen some of our lives, we've touched on these conversations, and I do think that, in a nutshell, MIRA is a regulatory authority that allows the House Armed Forces Committee and the Senate Armed Forces Committee to regulate the military through an arbitration board, and implement a number of different programs, licensing standards, restrictions, reporting outside the chain of command. It's literally like, it is much better fit as an anti-terrorism bill, and anti-terrorism legislation, because it is much more broad than just military sexual trauma, but it does combat sexism, racism, and discrimination, and the violence that erupts as military sexual trauma, hazing, retaliation. It does address all of that. We do have another live, Doris. So if you want to take a look at that live, you can send us a DM. One of our volunteers can send you the link to our Declassifying MIRA live that will tell you all about the legislation that we put together, that we've given to the House Armed Services Committee and the Senate Armed Forces Committee, and now that has been sent to the National Security Committee for review, and then the next steps will be implementation. So I want to turn over to Millie, and I want to ask you particularly how you feel about, or why you feel that anti-terrorism legislation and MIRA makes sense for the next generation of, Latinx women, in particular. What advice would you give to Latinx girls, especially because they're the most at risk to go through sexual violence in the military on a per capita basis?
Muted.
Oh. I think you're still on mute.
Sorry.
Oh, there we go.
Can you hear me?
All right, we're good.
Okay. So what I was saying is, when you mention those statistics about Latinx women, it still blows my mind. It doesn't matter how many times I hear it, but just the statistics are just outrageous in my mind. But for me, I look at my daughter, who is half Mexican, half American. Well, she's Mexican-American. And I've always said that I hope my kids go into the military, that they follow in my footsteps and my husband's footsteps and my brother's footsteps. I've always hoped that. And now, based on what I've gone through and what I've seen, and knowing that she is Mexican, that I don't want her to go into the military because, I don't want her to experience what I did. But it's hard because I loved being in the military. I loved the good of it. But unfortunately, the bad outweighed the good. And it's one of those careers, you have to put it's not a job that you would think you would have to put a caution label on for that reason. Like, yes, you know, you're going to go in the military. Yes, there's a chance of being deployed. Yes, there's a chance of this and that. But why does it have to be, yes, go serve your country. By the way, there's probably a big percentage that you're going to get raped in there, but that's okay because you're still serving your country. But don't worry, there won't be anything to like protect you if that happens or not. It's not even a matter of if for a lot of women, it's a matter of when, and that's scary. It shouldn't be a matter of if it happens or if you're doing this. It's become a matter of when. And I mean, I'm coming up on 19 years since my assault, and we're still talking about that. We're still talking about the repercussions, and we're still talking about the fact that there hasn't been anything implemented to protect people from this. And like I said, 19 years. And I mean, I know there's people that have been, you know, longer than that. So I don't know, my mind is all over the place right now. But yeah.
Well, I definitely appreciate you sharing your perspective. And I think everything you said is very valid, right? It's like, you know, I'm Puerto Rican, and as a Puerto Rican woman, like you know, as a Puerto Rican girl, because I skipped 11th grade. So my senior year, I was 16, and I was in 12th grade. So I started my enlistment process at 16 years old and went into the delayed entry program for when I graduated. And, you know, I had these really high hopes for what I was going to do with my future. And, you know, back then they didn't have statistics about what happens if you're a Latinx woman going into the military or a Latinx girl setting up. Like, they didn't have that. And, you know, and part of it is culture, right? A lot of it is culturally related because we've gone through what's called double colonization. And double colonization means that people that are from Latin America come from tribes, and people don't know that, right? Like, that's the headdress you see behind me is from the tribe that my family comes from. So the Latinx community comes from tribes, and when colonization happened with Spain, having conversations regarding sex, no matter whether it's sexual violence or sex itself, is pretty much strictly prohibited before marriage. So Latinx girls, ages 13 through 27, are the least likely to ever report. And when they do report sexual violence in the civilian sector or in the military, they're most likely to be denounced by their families and get blamed by their families for them getting raped. So there's additional cultural stigmas that happen and occur for Latinx girls. And I think, you know, that's part of the reason why we really want this legislation to go forward and feel that it's important for the next generation of Latinx girls, right? So I think based on each one of our experiences and, you know, what we're going through, it's been painful for us, and we don't want that to happen for our nieces and nephews, for our daughters and our sons, you know, for the next generation of people. We just don't want this to be happening. I want to turn this over to Ellie. And Ellie, what would you say to people who are allies, and, you know, what ways can they best help? And maybe what are some ways that you feel that people are being horrible allies?
I think, you know, I've seen this a lot, oddly enough, on TikTok a lot, the idea of performative allyship. And I also think it's very easy to kind of fall into clicktivism. You know, I mean, we saw it all of last summer, really, with, you know, that idea of Black Lives Still Matter, even though it isn't trending anymore. And I think that gets forgotten a lot by people who are trying to be allies, but at the end of the day, sharing something on Facebook isn't going to solve a root problem. It's not going to address what's really happening around us, even if, you know, we can't feel those effects, hashtag save the children isn't really actually going to save children, unfortunately. And so I think there's a lot of people who, I think supporting organizations is brilliant, volunteering when you can, but there's a lot of times in the movement that I step back and I shut up and I and I keep quiet because I'm not a veteran, and this is a space for veterans. So I think for allies, get involved. Absolutely do. But be aware that your job isn't to make your voice heard and say, I'm an ally to these people. Your job is to make sure that their voices are heard first before yours. And I think as a blind woman who has seen a lot of performative activism in her life, I think that's something I learned from my own experience. And then, when I found the movement, it became so apparent to me very, very quickly that I think a lot of allyship really is just shutting up. Just step down for a bit, learn to listen, and just be quiet.
I think we can all agree to that. I think a lot of us feel at times that, we'll sit there and we'll bring something forward, we'll get criticized for it, we'll get talked down about it when we're bringing up the issue, and then somebody comes in and they're like, they have this like savior complex of like, well, this was my idea, and you're like, how could it ever be your idea? Like, you've never gone through these systemic issues. So I think, that part of allyship is that when you're an ally, you're not putting yourself at the forefront. You're bringing the issue of others forward first. So I think that that's a great analysis. And, I think that's why we also feel that you're a great ally to us. I'm pretty sure all of us.
That means a lot. I do try. But yeah, I think that, coming from an LGBTQ plus woman and a blind woman, almost every community I've been involved in welcome allies with open arms. Absolutely. But, if people are a little skeptical of you and why you're there, they have every right to be, right? Because so many minority groups, I mentioned it earlier, using veterans as political pawns.
Yeah.
Right. Particularly people of color as well, and LGBTQ plus folks, like, they have every right to turn to you and say, okay, we need to make sure that you're not just here to massage your own ego, and they have every right to do that. Because a lot of people do use these issues to get ahead, to virtue signal on social media. So that's my advice to people who want to be allies. Don't be surprised if people do question your intentions in the beginning, and shut up about it.
I mean, it's good advice. It's actually great advice. I mean, because that does happen, right? Like, we've seen it happen a number of times. We've seen the virtue signaling. We've seen the savior like, we have seen that. We have seen people who come in as allies, or even other things and have not met those standards. So, I definitely appreciate your perspective on that. We've been on for about an hour, so I do want to wrap up for the night because I know that everyone has some plans for the evening. So I do want to say thank you to everyone who has come on the live tonight. Carrie, Albie, Millie, Ellie. I want to say thank you to all of you for coming on and talking about the importance of the direction that we're moving in, because, initially we were going to continue working on the I Am Vanessa Guillen Act, which we're still supporting. We're still supporting it. We're just having more robust legislation of MIRA getting consolidated with MJIA. So we're actually going to be doing both together. We're going to be continuing our lobbying efforts for both pieces of legislation because they will not act the same. One is going to be dealing with certain things with sexual assault specifically, and the other one is going in as anti-terrorism So I want to say thank you for everything that all of you have done, for the contributions that you've made, for the contributions you're continuing to make, and really for just being with us in 2021 and really seeing where we go with this. And, you know, just thank you for joining the fight to end MST.
Yeah, most definitely.